That winter, deep in the Blackwood Mountains of Montana Territory, a blizzard nearly buried a woman who refused to bow to the fate handed to her. "I'd rather die out here," Abigail said, teeth chattering against the cold, "than belong to anybody." The tall stranger, kneeling in front of her, a scar cutting clean across his face, didn't blink. "You've never met men our size," he said, and he didn't mean height. 3 mountain men, a marriage contract signed to the wrong name, and a choice no one saw coming. What made a woman once sold like cargo choose to stay with 3 strangers on that mountain? Stick around to find out and hit follow so you don't miss the next Western that hits this hard. Abigail Foster had been standing in the mud for almost an hour before she understood the shape of her own ruin. The letter in her hand still smelled like the broker's office back in Boston. Cheap ink and cheaper cologne. It named one man, James Calloway, landowner, Blackwood Mountain, Montana Territory. But the 3 men standing in front of the depot were not James Calloway. There was no James Calloway. There never had been. "There's been some kind of mistake," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "No mistake," the tallest one said. He had a scar that ran from his eyebrow to his jaw, the kind that told its own story without needing words. "Name's Garrison. This is Kale. That's Huck. We're the ones who filed the claim." "The claim," said one husband. "The claim said, Blackwood Mountain needs a wife inside 5 years or the land reverts to the territory. Didn't specify how many men could hold that claim together." Lawyer looked at it twice. "It's legal." Abby looked past him at the mountain, black and enormous against a sky already going gray at the edges. Somewhere behind her, a train whistle cried out and rolled away, and she understood that whatever ticket had brought her here was not going to carry her back. She thought about the mill, 14 hours a day, cotton dust in her lungs, a foreman who liked to stand too close. She had signed the marriage contract because it promised something the mill never had, a door she could close behind her. Now that door had turned into 3 of them, all of them huge, all of them strangers. "I won't be split 3 ways like a sack of flour," she said. "I'd rather take my chances." "Ma'am, there's a storm coming," the one called Huck said. And he wasn't smiling now the way he had been a moment ago. "You can see it in that sky." "Then I'll take my chances with the storm." She turned and walked into it. Nobody chased her right away. She would learn later that Garrison had stood there a long minute, watching her go, before he said the only thing that mattered. "We don't drag her back, but we don't let her die out there, either." The wind found her within 20 minutes. It came down off the mountain like something with teeth, and the snow followed it, thick and sideways, and the road under her boots disappeared. She kept walking because stopping felt like the same thing as giving up, and she had promised herself in Boston that she would never do that again. Her hands went numb first. Then her thoughts started to slow, stretching out long and strange. And somewhere in that stretching, she stopped being afraid and started being tired instead, which she dimly understood was worse. She went down onto one knee, then the other. The last clear thing she remembered was the sound, not wind. Boots, heavy ones, 3 sets, coming fast through snow that should have swallowed the sound whole. They found her curled against a boulder, her small pocket knife already out of her coat pocket and gripped in one shaking fist, held toward the dark like it could do anything at all against the size of what was coming. Garrison crouched down first. He didn't reach for the knife. "I'd rather die out here," she said, teeth chattering so hard the words barely held together, "than belong to anybody." He looked at her for a long moment. Snow caught in his eyelashes and didn't melt. "You've never met men our size, Abigail," he said, "and I don't mean our height." He was already working the buttons of his coat loose, and then it was off his shoulders and around hers, bearskin heavy as a blanket of iron, warm from his own body. "We don't break what's fragile. We don't take what isn't given freely. You're no one's property here. Not ours, not anybody's." She wanted to argue. She didn't have the strength left for it. Cale lifted her like she weighed nothing, careful of her hands, murmuring something low about frostbite and how they needed to move now, not later. Huck walked backward in front of them the whole way, rifle up, watching the tree line, laughing under his breath at something. Only, he found funny, the kind of laugh a man uses to keep his own hands from shaking. The cabin appeared out of the white like a ship out of fog, 2 stories of black timber, smoke, pouring sideways from the chimney, windows glowing gold. Inside, the heat hit her so hard it hurt, and someone was pulling off her frozen boots, and someone else was building the fire higher, and she was shaking too hard to thank any of them. "You'll have your own room," Garrison told her, kneeling by the hearth, once she was wrapped in dry blankets. "Door locks from your side, not ours. Come spring, if you still want it, we'll buy your ticket east ourselves." She studied his face for the lie in it, and didn't find one. "Why?" she asked. "Would you do that?" "Because a woman who isn't free to leave was never free to stay," he said. "We didn't bring you up this mountain to own you. We brought you up here so you wouldn't die, proving a point to men who never deserved the fight." Outside, the storm kept howling against the walls like something that hadn't finished with her yet. But for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Abby let herself close her eyes. Abby woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and for a moment she forgot where she was. The ceiling above her was rough-hewn log, not the water-stained plaster of her boarding house room in Boston. Her body ached in a dozen places, and her hands, when she flexed them, still stung from the cold. Then it came back to her. The station, the blizzard, the coat. She sat up too fast, and the room tilted. A quilt slid off her shoulders, patchwork and heavy, smelling faintly of cedar. She was in a small room off the main cabin, a real bed under her. A fire burning low in a stone hearth someone had clearly built up before dawn. Her boots sat drying by the flames, stuffed with paper. Someone had thought of that. Someone had thought of a lot of things. She found them in the main room when she finally worked up the courage to open her door. Garrison stood at the stove, sleeves rolled to his elbows, moving a skillet like he'd done it 10,000 times. Cale sat at the long table, hands wrapped around a tin cup, watching the window where the storm had finally worn itself out. Huck was cross-legged on the floor by the fire, cleaning a rifle he didn't seem to actually need to clean, humming something under his breath. All 3 of them looked up when she appeared. None of them said anything right away, which she appreciated more than she expected to. "Sit," Garrison finally said. "Eat something. You'll want your strength back before you decide anything." "I already decided things," Abby said, but she sat anyway. Because the smell of bacon was doing things to her stomach she couldn't argue with. Huck grinned at that, not unkindly. "Woman walks into a blizzard rather than sit down to breakfast with 3 strangers. That's decided." "All right, I wasn't running from breakfast." "No," Garrison said, setting a plate in front of her. "You were running from being owned. That's a different thing, and it's the right thing to run from." She looked up at him, waiting for the catch. There was always a catch. Men who said the right words usually wanted something bigger in exchange. And she had learned that lesson at the mill from foremen who called her a hard worker right before they cornered her in the stairwell. But Garrison had already turned back to the stove, and Cale was quietly refilling her cup without being asked. And Huck had gone back to his rifle, like the conversation was finished. "I want to understand the arrangement," she said. "The real one, not what's on the paper." Garrison pulled out a chair and sat across from her. And for the first time, she saw how tired he looked underneath the size of him, like a man who carried more than just his own weight. "Homestead Act requires improvement on the land and 5 years of residency to hold the claim," he said. "It also requires a household. A wife counts toward that in the eyes of the territory, whether folks like the notion or not. We filed together because none of us wanted this mountain for ourselves alone. We built it together. We intend to keep it together. And me, you're not a 4th pair of hands to work the claim, if that's what you're asking. You're not required to do anything you don't choose to do. Cook, don't cook. Stay in your room all winter if that's what keeps you steady. Come spring, if you want that ticket east, you'll have it. And none of us will hold it against you." That's a strange kind of marriage. Wasn't planning on calling it a marriage until you decided you wanted to call it something. Garrison said. Paper says, wife. Paper doesn't get a vote in what actually happens under this roof. Cale spoke then, quiet, his voice low and even. You held a knife on us last night, in the snow, half frozen, and you still held it up like you meant to use it. I did mean to use it. Good, he said, and there was no mockery in it. Means you know your own worth. Men who tries to take that from you will have to answer for it. Not just to Garrison, to me, to Huck, to you first. And you're the one who matters most in that line. Abby didn't know what to say to that, so she ate her breakfast instead. And the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, the way she expected silence with three strange men to be. It felt, oddly, like being given room to breathe. The days that followed took on a shape she hadn't expected. The snow kept the roads buried well into the second week, and there was nowhere to go, even if she'd wanted to. So she learned the cabin the way a person learns a new language, one small word at a time. She learned that Garrison rose before the sun and didn't wake anyone doing it, that he read from a worn Bible some mornings and a worn ledger other mornings, and that he'd once commanded men in a war that had taken something out of his eyes he never talked about directly. She learned that Cale moved through the cabin like the walls answered to him personally, silent on his feet despite his size, and that he kept a shelf of dried herbs and roots that he tended like other men tended livestock. And she learned that Huck talked more than the other two combined, filling silences with jokes half the time and truths the other half, though it took her longer to learn which was which. On the fourth day, she found herself sweeping the front room without anyone asking her to, and Huck leaned in the doorway, watching her with his arms crossed. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, then why? She stopped and looked at him. Because I want something to do with my hands that isn't waiting, he nodded slowly, like that answer satisfied something in him. Fair enough. Just don't let Garrison see you working yourself into the ground. Man's got strong opinions about women doing more than their share. And what does Huck have opinions about? He grinned, quick and easy. Huck's got opinions about everything. Ask Cale. He'll tell you it's my worst quality. It is, Cale said from the other room, not even raising his voice. And Huck laughed loud enough to shake the rafters. That night, over supper, Garrison told her plainly what she had already begun to suspect. You're not a prisoner here. Abby, door's not locked from our side. Never will be. A man who has to lock a door to keep a woman near him never deserved her company in the first place. Some men would call that foolish, she said, letting a woman come and go as she pleases. Some men are fools, Garrison said, and confuse a woman's fear for her loyalty. We don't want your fear. We want you standing here because you chose it, same as we chose this mountain. Anything less isn't worth having. She thought about that long after the fire had burned down to coals, lying awake in the small room that was somehow already starting to feel less like a stranger's house, and more like the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. By the third week, the storm outside had settled into something gentler, steady snowfall instead of screaming wind, and the cabin had settled too, into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like living. Abby found herself watching the three of them the way a person studies a puzzle they're not sure they're allowed to solve. She had grown up believing men came in only a few varieties. The kind who worked you until you broke. The kind who wanted something from your body and called it affection. And the rare, quiet kind who simply didn't notice you at all. She had never met men who did the wash without being asked, who cooked because they liked doing it and not because a woman had failed to, who noticed when she was cold before she said so, and simply handed her a blanket without comment or expectation of thanks. One evening, she found Garrison mending a torn shirt by firelight, needle moving with more precision than she expected from hands that big. You could ask me to do that, she said. Could, he agreed, not looking up. Don't need to. I've mended my own clothes since I was younger than you are now. Man learns to take care of himself in the army, or he doesn't survive it. My mother used to say a man who can't sew a button is a man who'll expect his wife to be his mother. Garrison finally looked up at that, something almost amused crossing his scarred face. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She died when I was 12. Mill fever. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Nobody ever changed the mill because of it. He set the shirt down. You worked the mills. Since I was 9. 14 hours some days. Cotton dust so thick you couldn't see across the floor by afternoon. She hadn't meant to say so much, but something about the fire and the quiet pulled it out of her. The broker who sold me this marriage told me it was a mercy, getting me out of that life. I believed him, mostly because I wanted so badly for it to be true. It wasn't a mercy, Garrison said. It was a man selling a person like she was cargo. There's a difference between rescuing somebody and profiting off their desperation. And most men who call themselves saviors are really just the second kind, wearing a kinder face. And you, what kind are you? Ask me again in the spring. Once you've seen what we do when nobody's forcing us to be decent, words are easy. I'd rather you judge us on what you see. That answer stayed with her longer than any grand declaration could have. A few days later, she sat by the hearth while Cale worked on her hands, which had blistered and cracked from the cold, despite her gloves. He held them with a gentleness that surprised her every time, turning them over, examining the skin, applying some pale salve that smelled of pine and something floral underneath. You favor your right hand less than your left, he said. Old injury. Mill accident. A loom caught 2 of my fingers when I was 15. They healed crooked. He traced the crooked knuckle without flinching or pitying her, just noting it the way he might note a bend in a river. Does it still pain you? When it's cold, which, in Boston, was most of the year. I can make something for that. Willow bark, mostly. Won't fix the bone, but it'll ease the ache. He looked up at her. Nobody ever tended to this properly. No, they should have. There was something in the plainness of it. No outrage performed for her benefit. No speech about the injustice of mill owners. Just a quiet acknowledgement that she had deserved better care than she'd gotten. That landed heavier than any lecture could have. Where did you learn healing? She asked. My mother. She was Shoshone. Learned it from her mother before her. He said it evenly, watching her reaction, the way a man watches for a door about to close. Some folks in town don't care for that fact about me. Called me worse than that fact. Plenty of times. I don't care where you learned it, Abby said. I care that my hands don't ache tonight. Something shifted in his face, small but real, like a weight had been set down. He hadn't realized he was still carrying into this particular room. Garrison says freedom's a thing a person owns, not a thing given to them, she said. Is that what your mother believed too? My mother believed a person's worth wasn't up for other people to decide. Spent her whole life having folks try to decide it for her anyway. Land wouldn't let her own it outright. Laws wouldn't let her marry who she chose without trouble. And still she raised me to know exactly who I was, regardless of what any paper said. That sounds like the same freedom Garrison talks about. It's the same freedom every person's owed, Cale said. Difference is who gets told they have to fight twice as hard to keep hold of it. Abby sat with that a long while after he'd finished wrapping her hands, turning the words over like stones in a creek bed, looking for the shape of a truth she was only beginning to understand. She had spent her whole life believing her worth was tied to what her hands could produce, what her body could withstand, what use she could be to someone else. Nobody had ever told her plainly that this was a lie built to keep her small, and that she was allowed, simply by existing, to be worth something regardless. She began to notice it everywhere after that, in the way Garrison asked her opinion on the household accounts instead of simply managing them himself, in the way Huck deferred to her preference on where to hang a shelf, then actually built it there instead of where he'd have put it on his own. Small things, but small things, added together over enough days, started to feel like a foundation. The thunderstorm rolled in on a night in late February, early for the season, and it announced itself with a crack of lightning that lit the whole cabin white for half a second before the thunder hit. Abby woke to the sound of something breaking in the front room. She found Huck on the floor by the cold hearth. back pressed into the corner where two walls met, knees pulled to his chest, breathing like a man running for his life while going nowhere at all. A cup lay shattered near his feet. Whatever had knocked it there, long past mattering now. Huck, she said his name soft, the way she might approach a spooked horse. He didn't look at her. His eyes were open, but they weren't seeing the room. Get down, he said, voice cracked and far away. Cannon's coming in. Get down. Garrison appeared in the doorway behind her, and for a moment, she thought he'd take over, handle it the way he handled everything, with calm authority. Instead, he stopped in the hallway, watching his jaw tight. Let her, Cale said quietly, appearing beside him. He needs a different kind of steady tonight than we can give him. Abby didn't fully understand what that meant, but she lowered herself to the floor anyway, keeping distance enough that she wasn't crowding him, close enough that he might notice she was there. Huck, it's Abby. There's no cannon. There's a storm, that's all. Thunder, not artillery. I know the difference, he snapped, and then quieter. Ashamed. I know the difference. Some nights my body doesn't. Tell me where you are, she said. Not where your mind's taken you. Your body actually is, right now. He blinked, slow like surfacing from deep water. Floor, cabin, Blackwood Mountain. What do you feel under your hands? He pressed his palms flat against the floorboards. Wood, cold wood. What do you hear? Thunder, wind. A long pause. You, breathing next to me. Good, she said. Stay there. Just that. Wood and wind and me breathing. They sat like that a long while, through two more claps of thunder that made him flinch, but didn't pull him back under, until his breathing finally slowed into something that resembled normal. I'm sorry you saw that, he said eventually, not looking at her. Don't be. Man's not supposed to fall apart in front of a woman he's meant to be protecting. Who told you that? Everybody. Every man I ever served under. Every story anybody ever told about what a man's supposed to be. Abby thought of Garrison in the doorway, not stepping in, letting her handle something he could have handled himself, and Cale beside him, understanding something about this moment that she was only starting to grasp. I watched a mill foreman break 3 of his fingers in a loom once, she said. He screamed, cried even, right there on the floor in front of 40 women. Nobody thought less of him for it. Pain doesn't check whether you're a man or a woman before it takes hold of you. Why should the aftermath be any different? This isn't a broken finger, Abby. It's worse, probably, which means it deserves more room to hurt, not less. He finally looked at her, something raw and unguarded in his face that she suspected very few people had ever been allowed to see. Cannon fire, he said. I was 18. Watched the man next to me get taken apart by a shell, and I didn't even have time to learn his last name. Some nights the thunder doesn't know the war's over. Neither does the part of me that lived through it. Thank you for telling me. Didn't figure I had much choice, considering the circumstances. You had a choice, she said. You could have told me to leave. Told me it was none of my business. I'd have gone. Didn't want you to go, he admitted. Quiet enough that the wind almost carried it away before she caught it. They stayed on that floor until the storm passed. And somewhere in those hours, something shifted between them that neither one of them tried to name out loud. In the days after, she noticed a change in how the men treated each other too. Or maybe she was only now able to see what had always been there. Garrison checked on Huck without making a show of checking, refilling his coffee, sitting near him at meals without comment. Cale brewed a tea, he said, helped settle a restless mind, and left it by Huck's cup each morning without being asked. You knew, she said to Cale one afternoon, watching him grind herbs at the table. About the storms. Before I did, known Huck 8 years. Fought beside him at the end of the war, before we ever came out here. Man's saved my life more times than I can count, and every single time a storm rolls through, some part of him goes right back to the worst day he ever lived. Why didn't you tell me before? Wasn't mine to tell. His story, his to share when he was ready, with who he was ready to share it with. Cale glanced up at her. He chose you last night. That matters more than you might realize. I didn't do anything special. You sat on a cold floor with a man having the worst moment of his month, and you didn't flinch, didn't pity him, didn't try to fix him faster than he could be fixed. That's not nothing, Abby. Most folks run from that kind of pain. Or worse, they use it against a person later. You didn't either. She thought about her own scars then. The crooked fingers, the years of exhaustion that had taught her to distrust anyone who claimed to care without wanting something back. I know what it is to carry something nobody else can see, she said. Seemed wrong to make him carry it alone just because I was frightened by the size of it. That right there, Cale said, is the whole of what makes a person worth loving. Not that they never break, that they don't look away when somebody else does. Later that evening, Huck found her alone by the fire and sat down across from her, turning his hat over in his hands, like he needed something to do with them. I want you to know, he said, that wasn't the whole of me you saw last night. There's more to me than what the war left behind. I know that. Huck, do you? I've seen you make Cale laugh until he nearly dropped a whole pot of stew. I've seen you carve a whistle for no reason at all, except that you thought it might make me smile. That's the whole of you, too. Doesn't cancel out the other part. Just sits alongside it. He studied her for a long moment, something warm breaking loose behind his eyes. You've got a way of saying things plain that makes a man feel less like he's drowning. Good, she said, because from where I'm sitting, none of us are drowning anymore. Just learning how to swim in the same direction. Outside, the last of the storm clouds broke apart, and moonlight spilled thin and silver across the snow, and inside the cabin. 4 people, who had each spent their lives being told their worth, was conditional sat together in the quiet, discovering, slowly, that it never had to be. The morning started ordinary enough, which was, Abby had learned, usually a sign that something was about to go sideways. Garrison had gone out at first light to split wood for the barn, whistling something low under his breath, his axe ringing steady against the cold air. Cale was mending a fence post near the tree line, and Huck sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle for the second time that week, more out of habit than necessity. Abby stood at the wash basin inside, sleeves rolled, hands red from the cold water, when she heard the first howl. It wasn't distant. That was the thing that made her stomach drop before her mind even caught up to the sound. Distant howls were a fact of mountain life, background noise like wind or crows. This one was close enough that she felt it in her teeth. Then came a second howl, answering the first, and a third. She was at the window in 2 steps. Through the frost-fogged glass, she saw them, 6 or 7 of them, moving low and fast along the tree line where Cale had been working a moment ago. Winter had been hard on the mountain this year, hard enough to starve a pack down to something desperate. And desperate animals didn't wait for an invitation. Cale, she shouted, and didn't wait to see if he'd heard her before she grabbed the rifle off the wall pegs, the one Garrison had shown her how to load her second week on the mountain. Back when she'd insisted she wasn't going to sit in a corner being useless just because she was new to a place. Huck was already off the porch, moving fast for a man his size, rifle up, shouting something at Cale that Abby couldn't make out over the wind. She went out the door after him, cold slamming into her lungs, and saw Cale backing toward the cabin with his hatchet in one hand, the pack fanning out around him in a loose, patient circle, the way animals moved when they knew they had the numbers and just needed to wait for an opening. Cale down, Huck bellowed, and Cale dropped flat into the snow the second the words left him. No hesitation, no argument, just trust. And Huck's rifle cracked once, and the lead wolf went down mid-stride. The others didn't scatter. Hunger had made them bold past the point good sense would normally allow. 2 peeled off toward Huck, and Abby realized with a jolt that the closest wolf, the biggest one, wasn't looking at either man at all. It was looking at her, standing exposed in the cabin doorway. She didn't think. She raised the rifle the way Garrison had drilled into her, over and over. Patient as a stone, even when she'd missed a barn wall from 30 feet the first week. And she fired. The shot went wide, kicking up snow a foot from the animal's flank, but it was enough to spook it sideways. enough for Kale to close the distance and bring the hatchet down before it could recover. Abby's ears rang. Her hands shook so hard, she nearly dropped the rifle reloading it. But she got the next round in anyway, because stopping wasn't an option. Not with two more wolves circling and Huck's rifle empty at his side while he wrestled his knife free. "Abby, left side," Kale shouted. She turned, saw the wolf closing on Huck's blind flank, and fired again. This time the shot landed true, catching the animal's shoulder, dropping it hard enough that Huck finished it with his knife a half-second later, breathing hard. Snow and blood freckled across his coat. By the time Garrison came crashing through the trees, axe still in hand, drawn by the gunfire, it was over. 4 wolves down, the rest scattered back into the timber, and the 3 of them and Abby standing in a ragged half-circle in the trampled, red-stained snow, chests heaving. "Alive. You could have stayed inside," Garrison said to her, once he'd caught his breath, though there wasn't any real reproach in it. More disbelief than anything. "I could have," Abby agreed. "Didn't feel much like a woman who stays inside while people I care about are getting torn apart." Something moved across Garrison's face at that, quick and complicated, and he didn't say anything else, just nodded once. The way a man nods when a fact has been settled that he's not yet ready to speak out loud. Back inside. The adrenaline didn't fade so much as it curdled into something shaky and loud in Abby's chest. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling even after she'd set the rifle down, even after Garrison had built the fire up higher than it needed to be, even after Huck had poured her a cup of something strong-smelling that he swore was medicinal. Kale had a shallow gash along his forearm where a wolf's claw had caught him in the scramble. Not deep, but bleeding steady. And Abby found herself kneeling in front of him at the table before she'd consciously decided to do it. Cleaning the wound with water Huck had warmed, her hands finally steadying now that they had a task to hold on to. "You didn't have to do this," Kale said quietly, watching her work. "You keep saying that to me. About the washing, about the wood. Now about this." She wrapped a clean strip of cloth around the cut, tighter than strictly necessary. An excuse to keep her hands busy a moment longer. "Maybe I've decided I like having things I don't have to do. That's not the same as wanting to do them." "No," she said. "It's better." She looked up at him then, and something in the room changed. Quiet and total. The way weather changes on the mountain. No warning. Just suddenly, the air is different than it was a moment before. Kale's eyes were dark and steady on hers, and she was close enough to see the fine lines at the corners of them. Close enough to feel the warmth still coming off his skin from the fight outside. She didn't decide to kiss him so much as she simply stopped deciding not to. It was soft at first, careful, the way a person tests ice before trusting their whole weight to it. Kale went very still beneath her hands, like he was afraid one wrong movement would break whatever was happening. And then his uninjured arm came up slow and settled at her waist, not pulling, just resting there. An offer rather than a demand. When she finally drew back, her heart was going harder than it had during the whole wolf attack. "I didn't plan that," she admitted. "Didn't need you to plan it," Kale said. Voice rough, in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "Just needed you to want it, which I'm guessing you did, since you're the one who did it." From the doorway, Huck cleared his throat loudly enough that both of them jumped. He was leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, grinning wide enough to show teeth. And behind him, Garrison stood with an expression that was trying very hard to look neutral and failing. "Don't mind us," Huck said, just admiring the view. "Get out," Kale said, without any real heat in it. And Huck laughed and did not move at all. Abby felt heat climb up her neck, embarrassment, and something else tangled together. Something that had been building for weeks now under the surface of ordinary days. Wood chopped and meals cooked and hands mended, and she understood. Standing there in the firelight, with 3 men watching her like she was the only remarkable thing in the room. That whatever this was, it was no longer something she could pretend not to notice. "I'm not sorry," she said to all 3 of them. "Didn't figure you would be," Garrison said quietly. "None of us are asking you to be." That night, after the wolves and the fear and the strange bright thing that had cracked open between her and Cale. Abby lay awake in her small room and did not, for the first time since arriving on the mountain, feel like a stranger in it. She heard the low murmur of voices through the wall, the three of them talking in the front room, unhurried, the way men talk when they're working something out between themselves that matters. She didn't try to listen closely. She trusted, by now, that whatever they decided wouldn't be decided without her. A soft knock came at her door near midnight. "It's Garrison," came the voice, low. "May I come in?" She sat up, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. "You may." He entered slow, closing the door behind him with a care that felt deliberate, like a man handling something he didn't want to damage. He didn't come far into the room, just stood near the hearth, firelight carving shadows across the scar on his face. "I want to say something plain," he said, "and I want you to know you can tell me no, and nothing changes between us if you do." "All right, what happened today?" With Cale. It wasn't just him that noticed. "Huck's cared for you since the second week, though the fool's been too busy making jokes, to say it outright. And I've thought about you every night since I put my coat around your shoulders in that storm, wondering if a woman who'd been sold once by men who saw her as property could ever want to be wanted by men who saw her as something else entirely. And what is it you see? A woman who fought wolves today rather than hide. A woman who taught Huck he didn't have to be ashamed of what the war left in him. A woman Cale trusts enough to let see him bleed." He took a slow breath. "I see somebody I'd be a fool to let walk out of this house come spring, if she doesn't want to walk." "That's not really an answer to what you're asking me." "No," he admitted. "I suppose it's a question, dressed up as one." Abby looked at him a long moment. This scarred, careful man who had never once, in all these weeks, asked her for anything he hadn't first made certain she wanted to give. "I don't know how three men and one woman are supposed to build a life together," she said. "I've never heard of such a thing. Never read of it. Don't know the shape it's meant to take." "Neither do we," Garrison said. "We only know we don't want the shape everybody else has already decided is proper. If proper means you belong to one of us, and the rest of us pretend we don't feel what we feel, that's a lie we're not willing to live inside. And if I choose all three of you, is that not its own kind of scandal? Only scandal that matters to me is a woman living less than the whole truth of what she wants, just to keep the town happy." He held out a hand, not pulling her toward him, simply offering it. "Whatever you decide tonight, or any night after, the choice stays yours. Always yours. That's the one promise I'll ask you to hold me to." She took his hand. What followed was not something Abby had words ready for. Not from the mill town she'd grown up in, where love, when it existed at all, was something people did quietly and apologetically, ashamed of wanting anything at all. Garrison called Cale and Huck in, and there was a long moment where all four of them simply stood together by the fire, the weight of the choice settling honest and unhurried in the room. Huck was the one who finally broke the quiet, reaching for her hand with none of his usual jokes in his face. Just something raw and hopeful instead. "You don't have to want all of us the same," he said. "I know I'm not built like Garrison, steady as stone, and I'm not built like Cale. Gentle in that quiet way of his. I'm just me, loud and unfinished in places. I don't want you to be either of them." Abby said, "I want you exactly as unfinished as you are." What happened after was slow and full of question marks, each one answered before the next was asked. Garrison undid nothing that she didn't first guide his hands toward. Huck made her laugh even here, in this breathless and easy, until the laughing turned into something quieter and just as sweet. Kay, still favoring the arm she'd bandaged that afternoon, moved with a patience that made her feel like the only thing worth being patient for in the whole of the territory. There was no shame in any of it. That was the thing Abby noticed most. Turning it over afterward, in the deep hours of the night, while three sets of arms kept her warm in ways the bearskin coat never could, nobody demanded. Nobody took without asking first, in words or in the quiet language of a hand pausing, waiting to be told yes. Garrison's steadiness anchored her when the newness of it All threatened to overwhelm her. Cale's quiet made room for her own voice to be heard, not talked over. And Huck, for all his teasing, turned out to be the gentlest of them in his own way. Careful with her exactly where she needed carefulness most. "This is madness," she murmured near dawn, her head resting against Garrison's chest, Cale's hand loose around her wrist, Huck's leg tangled with hers under the quilt. "Maybe," Garrison said, "or maybe it's just honesty. Most folks spend their whole lives pretending they only need one kind of love to be whole. We're not most folks. The whole territory will call it something ugly if they ever find out. Let them call it whatever they need to call it," Huck said, half asleep already. "Doesn't change what it actually is, lying here in this bed. Only the four of us know that truth, and that's plenty enough people to matter." Abby closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not measure her own worth against what she could produce, what she could survive, or what anyone else believed she should want. She simply existed, chosen and choosing, in a house built by men who had learned, the hard way, that love wasn't a thing you took. It was a thing you were given permission to keep, over and over, for as long as it kept being freely offered. Spring came to Blackwood Mountain the way it always did, reluctant and then all at once, snowbanks collapsing into mud, the creek behind the cabin swelling loud with meltwater, the first green pushing up stubborn through soil that had been frozen solid for months. Abby had grown so used to the rhythm of the winter, the four of them bound together by cold and isolation, that the sound of a wagon rolling up the mountain road one bright April morning felt like an intrusion from another life entirely. She was in the garden when she heard it, turning soil with a hoe, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair coming loose from its pins. Garrison appeared at her side before she'd even straightened up, his rifle already in hand. And behind him, Cale and Huck emerged from the barn, moving with the unhurried readiness of men who had learned, in another life, how to prepare for trouble without letting it show on their faces. "That's not a friendly wagon," Garrison said quietly. He was right. Four men rode alongside it, hired guns by the look of their rifles and the way they sat their horses. And behind them came a fifth rider in a fine black coat entirely wrong for mountain travel, and a sixth man in a judge's robes that looked as out of place on that muddy road as a chandelier in a barn. "Bartholomew Thorne," Garrison said, low, like the name itself tasted bad. "You know him. Everyone who's ever tried to hold land in this territory knows him. Man's bought up half the homesteads between here and the county line, one way or another. Some folks sold to him willingly, others just disappeared, and the land got sold at auction not long after. Real convenient like." Thorne's wagon rolled to a stop at the edge of the yard, and the man himself climbed down with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his life doubted he'd get what he wanted eventually. "Mr. Garrison," Thorne said, tipping his hat with mocking politeness. "And gentlemen, I confess I'm surprised to see you all still standing. And you." His eyes settled on Abby with an expression she recognized instantly. The same calculating look the mill foreman used to give the newest girls on the floor. "Miss Foster, is it? I was told you'd have frozen or fled by January. Man in my employ described you as a delicate thing." "Your employ," Abby repeated, cold settling through her that had nothing to do with the spring air. "You're the broker. You arranged the contract. I arranged an opportunity," Thorne said smoothly, "for everyone involved. These men needed a wife to hold their claim, and I happened to know of a young woman in desperate need of passage out of a difficult situation. I hardly expected sentiment to complicate a simple business transaction." "You expected me dead," Abby said, "or driven mad. Either way, the claim reverts, and you take the land." Something flickered behind Thorne's eyes, gone as fast as it appeared. But Garrison caught it too. She could tell by the way his jaw tightened. "An unfortunate accusation," Thorne said. "I've brought Judge Kavanaugh here today on entirely separate business. There have been concerns raised, you understand, about the legitimacy of a residency claim held by three unmarried men and a woman of, shall we say, questionable arrangement. Bigamy is a serious matter in this territory. There's no bigamy where there's no legal marriage to any one man, Garrison said. You know that. You had your own lawyer draft the claim language specifically because there was no marriage requirement, only residency and improvement. Precisely so you could sell us a wife you assumed would ruin us by scandal instead. A clever theory, Thorne said. Difficult to prove. We don't need to prove it, Abby said. We just need to survive you. Thorne's smile thinned, a bold statement from a woman standing in a garden with dirt on her hands. Married to no one. Protected by nothing but the goodwill of 3 men who'll tire of the arrangement eventually. Judge Kavanaugh is prepared to review the claim's validity. I'd advise cooperation. Get off our land, Garrison said, and there was nothing polite left in his voice at all. Thorne studied him a moment, then glanced at his hired men, doing some private calculation about odds that Abby couldn't follow but understood well enough. By the way, he ultimately smiled and stepped back toward his wagon. We'll speak again, he said. The judge will need to review the paperwork properly. These things take time. I do so hope nothing unfortunate happens to your claim in the meantime. The wagon rolled away down the muddy road, and the 4 of them stood watching until it disappeared around the bend, none of them speaking until the sound of hooves had faded entirely. That man means to burn us out one way or another, Huck said finally. Or worse, Cale added. It was 3 days later that they caught the scout. Abby found him first, actually. A young man skulking near the tree line with a spyglass and a satchel, clearly under instructions to watch the homestead's comings and goings and report back. Huck had him on the ground with a knee in his back before the boy could so much as reach for his pistol. Please, the scout said, face pressed into the mud. No older than 19 by the look of him. I'm just paid to watch. I don't want no part of what Thorne's planning. What is he planning? Garrison asked, voice flat and dangerous, in a way Abby hadn't heard from him before. The boy talked fast, the way frightened young men often do when the alternative feels worse than betrayal. Thorne meant to burn the barn if intimidation didn't work, drive them off the land through fear if the courts couldn't manage it fast enough. And he had judges in 3 counties bought outright. Men who'd sign whatever deed transfer Thorne put in front of them once the homesteaders were gone, one way or another. While they questioned him, Abby went through the boy's satchel and found the ledger, small and unassuming, the kind of thing a man carries because he trusts no one else to keep his secrets safe. Inside, page after page in careful handwriting, names of homesteaders across 3 counties, dates, sums of money paid to judges, and besides several names, a single word that made her blood run cold. Settled. Next to notations that read less like land transactions and more like confessions to violence. Garrison, she said, holding it out with hands that had gone unsteady. You need to see this. He read it slowly, and she watched his face change. Watched the careful control he usually wore slip into something harder and colder. This is enough to hang him, Garrison said quietly. If it ever reaches an honest judge, then we need to find one, Abby said. Before Thorne finds out this is missing. They let the young scout go, on the promise that he'd say nothing of what he'd seen. And Cale tracked his retreat, far enough to be certain he was telling the truth about going straight back down the mountain and nowhere near Thorne's camp first. That night, the 4 of them sat around the table with the ledger between them, the weight of what they now knew settling heavy over the whole cabin. He'll come for this land soon, Garrison said, now that his scout's exposed. He knows we suspect him. Man like Thorne doesn't wait once he's cornered. He gets desperate. And desperate men with money and hired guns are the most dangerous kind there is. Then we're ready for him, Abby said. Garrison looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had walked into a blizzard rather than be owned, who had fought off wolves with a rifle she'd only learned to use months before, who had built, out of nothing but her own stubborn will, a family that the whole territory would call scandalous if they ever understood the truth of it. Yes, he said finally. I believe we are. Outside, the spring wind moved through the new grass, and somewhere down the mountain, Bartholomew Thorne was already planning the fire that would try, and failed to take everything they'd built. The attack came 4 nights later, and it came the way Garrison had warned it would. Not with warning shots or shouted demands first, but with fire. Abby smelled the smoke before she heard anything else. Sharp and wrong against the cool night air, and she was out of bed and pulling on her boots before her mind had even finished putting the pieces together. Through her window, she saw the barn already catching, flames licking up the old dry timber, faster than any fire had a right to move. Orange light, throwing long shadows across the melting snow. Abby, stay low. Garrison's voice cut through the chaos from somewhere near the front of the cabin. And then the first gunshot cracked the night open, and she understood, all at once, that this was no accident and no small trouble. She grabbed the rifle from beside her bed, the one that had become as familiar to her hands now as a sewing needle once was, and made her way to the front room in a crouch, keeping below the windows the way Cale had drilled into her during quiet afternoons she'd assumed, at the time, were simply precaution and nothing more. The front room was chaos organized into purpose. Huck was at the east window, rifle braced on the sill, firing in short controlled bursts at shapes moving in the tree line. Cale had the west side covered, moving low, calm as still water, despite the bullets splintering the log walls near his head. Garrison stood near the door, reloading with hands that didn't shake at all. How many? Abby asked, dropping beside him. 8, maybe 10. Thorne's paying well for men willing to burn a family out of their own home. He glanced at her, quick, assessing. You don't have to be out here. I'm not staying in that room while my home burns down around me. Something passed over his face. Gratitude and worry tangled together. And then another volley of shots hit the porch, and there wasn't time for anything but the fight. Outside, the barn was fully engulfed now, throwing enough light across the yard that Abby could see the shapes of Thorne's hired men moving between the trees, using the darkness at the edges for cover, while the fire lit up anything closer to the cabin. The porch had caught too, a lick of flame crawling up the support post nearest the door, and the smell of smoke was getting thick enough now to sting her eyes. They mean to burn us out if the bullets don't work, Cale called from his window. Smart of them, in a cruel sort of way. Fire doesn't care how good a shot a man is. Then we don't let it spread, Garrison said. Abby, there's water barrels around back, but you can't reach them from here without crossing open ground. I'll go, she said. You will not. Garrison, someone has to. And you three are the only thing keeping those men from walking right through that door. I'm the only one who can be spared. He looked at her for one long, furious second, torn clearly between the truth of what she'd said and every instinct in his body screaming against it. Then he nodded, once sharp, low and fast. Cale, cover the back corner the second she moves. She went out the rear door into smoke and chaos, keeping to the shadow of the cabin wall, a bucket already in each hand before her mind had fully caught up to what her body was doing. The heat off the burning porch hit her like a physical wall as she rounded the corner, and a bullet chewed splinters out of the wood a foot above her head, close enough that she felt them sting her cheek. She didn't stop moving. She filled the buckets at the rain barrel with hands that shook and threw the water at the base of the porch flames. Once, twice, a third time. Enough to slow the spread, even if it wasn't enough to kill it outright. A shape moved in the smoke to her left, too close, and she spun with the empty bucket raised before some part of her brain recognized it as KL, already firing past her, at whoever had gotten close enough to make him abandon his post. Inside now, he barked, and she didn't argue. Back inside, breathless and singed at the edges, Abby found Huck reloading with blood on his sleeve, a graze along his forearm he was ignoring entirely. You're hit, she said, barely. Ask me again when this is finished. He managed a grin even now, teeth bright against the smoke-darkened room. Man's got to keep his priorities straight. Through the chaos, a voice rose above the gunfire, amplified by something. A speaking trumpet, maybe, carrying clear across the yard. Garrison, Thorne's voice. This need not end in bloodshed. Release the woman into my custody, and I'll see she's returned safely east, as was always intended. The claim reverts peacefully. Nobody else need die tonight. He's lying, Abby said immediately. I know, Garrison said. Doesn't mean he won't say it loud enough that a judge somewhere later hears the story he wants told. Man's building himself a version of tonight where he's the reasonable one. Then we make sure that story never gets told the way he wants. She thought of the ledger, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room since the day they'd taken it off the Scout. Page after page of names and dates and quiet confessions to murder, dressed up as land transactions. Thorne didn't know they had it yet. Not for certain. That ignorance was the one advantage they still held. I'm not going out there to be handed over, she called back toward the window, loud enough to carry. You sold me once already. Thorne. I wasn't property then, and I'm not property now. A ragged cheer went up from inside the cabin. Huck's laugh loud and fierce, even through the danger. And outside, Abby heard Thorne's voice go tight, with the first real anger she'd heard from him. Then you'll burn with them, he shouted, and the gunfire redoubled. The night stretched on in a blur of smoke and noise, and Abby lost track of how long they'd been fighting, only that her ears rang constant now from the gunfire, and her hands had gone raw from reloading again and again. The barn had collapsed sometime past midnight, folding in on itself in a shower of sparks that lit the whole yard bright as day for a few terrible seconds. And in that light, Abby saw Thorne's men clearly, for the first time, hard-faced and grim. Professional in the way they moved between cover. Nothing like the drunken bravado she might have expected. These were men who did this kind of work for a living, and the realization settled cold and certain in her chest that this fight could still be lost. They're pulling back toward the barn ruins. Cale called out, watching the tree line. Regrouping. Judge Kavanaugh's out there too, Garrison said grimly, having caught a glimpse of the man's fine coat in the firelight some minutes before. Keeping well back from the actual fighting, the way men who profit from violence always did. He'll want this cabin's deed signed over before dawn, one way or another. Whatever story gets told after. Then we tell our own story first, Abby said. She was already moving toward her room before anyone could stop her, pulling the loose floorboard free, the ledger cold and solid in her hands, the weight of every name in it heavier than the paper itself. When she came back, Garrison's face went taut with understanding, and something like fear, real fear, the kind she hadn't seen from him even during the worst of the wolf attack. Abby, no, whatever you're thinking, no. That door doesn't open again tonight. They can't argue with proof. Not in front of witnesses. Not with the judge himself standing right there. They can shoot you before you finish a single sentence. Then you'll all have to make sure they don't get the chance. There was no time to argue further, because the gunfire outside had shifted, a lull settling over the yard as Thorne's men reorganized. And in that lull came Thorne's voice again, closer now, bold with the confidence of a man who believed the night was already his. Judge Kavanaugh is prepared to formalize the claim reversion right now, Thorne called. Save yourselves further trouble. Surrender the property. And this ends peacefully. Abby didn't wait for Garrison's permission. She was at the door before Huck could grab her arm, and then she was out on the burning porch itself. Flames still smoldering along one edge of it, smoke curling up around her skirts. The ledger held high enough that firelight caught the leather cover. Mrs. Foster, get back inside. Thorne's voice cracked with something that might have been genuine alarm, though whether for her safety or his own plans, Abby couldn't say. Judge Kavanaugh, she shouted, and her voice carried clear across the yard, steadier than she had any right to expect, given how hard her heart was hammering. I have Mr. Thorne's ledger, every homestead he's stolen these past 3 years, every judge he's paid to look away, every family that disappeared after refusing to sell. It's all here, in his own scout's handwriting. And I'll read every name on this page out loud right now, unless somebody makes him answer for it. The yard went very still. Even the gunfire seemed to pause. Hired men, glancing toward their employer, with expressions that suggested this development had not been part of whatever arrangement they'd been paid for. A man willing to shoot at homesteaders for money was one thing. Standing beside a public admission of murder was another matter entirely. "That's fabricated," Thorne shouted. But his voice had lost its earlier smoothness, gone ragged at the edges. "A desperate woman's forgery, nothing more." "Then you won't mind Judge Kavanaugh examining it himself," Abby called back. "In fact, why don't I just throw it right at his feet, so there's no accusation later that anybody tampered with it?" She flung the ledger out into the yard before Garrison could stop her, watching it land in the mud just short of where the judge stood, pages fanning open in the firelight. And Kavanaugh, whatever else he was still enough of a man concerned with his own skin that he bent down and picked it up rather than let it lie there, unexamined with armed witnesses on both sides watching. The silence stretched while he read, flipping pages with hands that trembled slightly. And Abby watched the color drain slowly out of his face as whatever he found there sank in. "This names me," Kavanaugh said finally, voice strangled, directly. "Payments received." "It names a dozen judges," Thorne snapped. "Burn it, you fool." "Before what?" Kavanaugh said, and something in his voice had shifted now, calculation replacing fear. The particular arithmetic of a corrupt man realizing the numbers had changed. "Before I hang alongside you?" "I think not." Whatever loyalty had existed between Thorne and his hired judge dissolved right there in the mud and firelight. Kavanaugh backed away from him, and the hired guns, sensing the fracture, exchanged glances of their own. Men paid to intimidate homesteaders were one thing. Men caught standing beside evidence of a hanging offense, in front of a judge scrambling to distance himself, were a different calculation altogether. "This isn't finished," Thorne snarled, drawing his own pistol now, aiming it wildly toward the porch where Abby still stood. Garrison was through the door before the shot could clear, tackling Abby down behind the porch rail as the bullet splintered wood where she'd been standing a half-second before. Cale and Huck came out firing, and Thorne's remaining men, already unraveling, broke and scattered into the tree line rather than die for a man whose own judge had just abandoned him. Thorne stood alone in the yard, pistol still raised, and Garrison rose from where he'd shielded Abby, rifle steady, years of war and restraint, holding his aim perfectly level. "Drop it," Garrison said. "This ends now, one way or the other. Your choice which way." For a moment, Thorne looked like he might actually fire again, some final desperate calculation running behind his eyes. Then Huck's rifle cracked, precise and merciless, and the pistol flew from Thorne's hand along with 2 fingers, and the man dropped screaming into the mud. All his careful cruelty, reduced in an instant to nothing more than a wounded animal howling in the dirt. "Not out of vengeance," Garrison said quietly, standing over him. "Just so you understand that. We fought tonight to protect what's ours, nothing more." A year turned the mountain green again, and on a bright morning in late spring, Abby walked into town with her hand resting easy against the curve of her belly, 7 months along and glowing in a way that had nothing to do with the sunshine. Garrison walked at her right, Cale at her left, and Huck a half-step behind, rifle slung casual over his shoulder, whistling, something cheerful that carried down the whole main street. Blackwood had changed some since the fire. Thorne sat in a territorial prison now, along with Judge Kavanaugh, both men undone finally by their own ledger, by the testimony of a dozen homesteaders who'd survived his schemes, and one who hadn't been afraid to throw the proof of it at a judge's feet in the middle of a gunfight. The barn had been rebuilt, bigger and better than before, and the cabin bore new timber along one wall where fire had once threatened to take everything. The town, though, still didn't quite know what to make of the family walking down its main street. Whispers followed them the way they always did. Hushed conversations behind shop windows. A woman married by no formal ceremony to 3 men at once. A scandal by any account the territory's churches would recognize. Abby had grown used to the whispers over the past year, had learned to walk through them the same way she'd once walked into a blizzard rather than accept a life somebody else had decided for her. "Morning, Mrs. Foster," the shopkeeper's wife said as they entered the general store, her voice carrying just enough frost to make her opinion plain, even while her words stayed polite. "Morning," Abby answered warmly, refusing to let the chill land anywhere it might take root. She moved through the store, gathering what they needed. Seed for the garden, thread for mending, a length of soft flannel, the Kale had mentioned, might make good baby clothes. And if she noticed the stares following her, the murmured conversations that dropped the moment she came within earshot, she didn't let it slow her step. Near the counter, an older woman, thin-lipped and clearly emboldened by whatever gossip had been circulating all winter, finally said what half the town had apparently been thinking. "It isn't right," the woman said, not quite to Abby directly, but loud enough to be heard by everyone in the store. "A decent woman, carrying on the way you have. What kind of example does that set?" The store went quiet. Abby felt Garrison shift slightly behind her. Felt Cale's stillness turn into something more deliberate. Felt Huck's easy posture straighten just slightly. And she understood that all three of them were waiting to see what she wanted from them, ready to step forward or hold back entirely at her signal. She didn't need them to speak for her. "The example I'd like to set," Abby said, turning to face the woman directly, voice calm and clear enough to carry through the whole store, "is that a woman gets to choose the shape of her own life. I was sold once, ma'am, by a man who saw me as cargo to be traded for a homestead claim. These three men could have kept that arrangement, could have treated me exactly the way that broker intended, as property to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Instead, they gave me a locked door I could bolt from my own side, a rifle and the trust to use it, and enough respect to let me decide, every single day since, whether I wanted to stay. That's a strange kind of virtue to be preaching in a general store," the woman said, though with less certainty now. "Maybe," Abby said, "but I'd rather my child grow up knowing that love looks like choice, freely given and freely returned, than grow up believing respectability matters more than honesty. I won't apologize for a family built on both those things. And I don't much care whether the whole territory approves, so long as the four of us, soon to be five, know exactly what we've built and why it's worth having." The silence that followed held for a long moment, and then unexpectedly, another woman near the back of the store, a homesteader's wife Abby, recognized from a claim 2 mountains over, spoke up quietly. "My husband and I lost our first deed to Thorne's scheming," she said. "Would have lost everything if not for what you four did, dragging his crimes out into the light, whatever the rest of the town wants to whisper about. You've got my thanks, Mrs. Foster, whatever we're meant to call you." Abby smiled at that, something warm settling through her that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine outside. "Abby will do just fine," she said, outside, as they walked back toward the wagon. The town sheriff crossed the street to meet them, hat already coming off his head in a gesture of plain respect that would have been unthinkable a year before. "Ma'am," he said, nodding to Abby, then to each of the men in turn. "Word came through this morning. Territorial courts upheld your claim outright. Full title. No further contest expected. Not with Thorne and Kavanaugh both looking at the rest of their lives behind bars." "Thank you, Sheriff," Garrison said. "Ought to be thanking you," the sheriff said. "Half the honest homesteaders in this territory are sleeping easier, knowing men like Thorne don't operate here unchecked anymore. However folks want to talk about your household arrangements, can't argue with what you did for this whole valley." He tipped his hat once more to Abby specifically, a small gesture, but a deliberate one, and walked on. They loaded the wagon in comfortable quiet, the mountain rising green and vast behind the town. Home waiting for them at the end of the road, same as it had every day since that first terrible blizzard. Huck helped her up onto the seat with exaggerated care, earning an eye roll from Cale and a laugh from Abby herself. And Garrison took the reins, and the four of them, soon to be five, rode back up toward Blackwood Mountain together. Behind them, the whispers would continue for a while yet, small towns being what they were, slow to change and slower still to admit when they'd been wrong about a thing. But ahead of them lay a home rebuilt stronger than the fire that had tried to take it. A family shaped by choice rather than obligation. And a future neither the mill town of Abby's childhood nor the broker who'd sold her like cargo could ever have imagined possible. She had come to this mountain, believing freedom was something men decided to give or withhold. She left that belief behind somewhere between the blizzard and the wolves and the fire, replaced by a truth Garrison had spoken to her that very first night, one she carried with her still. Freedom wasn't a piece of paper. It was the breath in her lungs, the choice in her hands, and the family she had built, deliberately and without apology, out of nothing but her own unbroken will to belong to no one but herself and everyone she loved, all at once. Abigail Foster's story did not begin in the mountains. It began in silence in factory halls filled with cotton dust, in contracts written by men who never once looked her in the eye as a human being. She was told her life had already been priced, already been decided, already been sold. And like so many women of her time, she was expected to accept that as fate. But fate, as the mountains would teach her, is only another word for fear when no one dares to resist it. When she stepped off that train into Montana, she was not stepping into salvation. She was stepping into uncertainty, into a contract disguised as opportunity, into a world where even freedom wore the mask of ownership. And yet, in that impossible place, something unexpected happened. The illusion of control broke down. The script she had been given stopped making sense. And in its place, something real began to grow. Not ownership, not obligation, not rescue, but choice. What makes this story endure is not the violence of the storm, nor the fire, nor even the men who tried to bend the land and people to their will. It is the slow, deliberate rebuilding of what it means to be a person in a world that constantly tries to turn people into property. Abigail did not belong to anyone in that cabin on Blackwood Mountain. Not to Garrison, not to Cale, not to Huck. And for perhaps the first time in her life, she belonged fully to herself. That truth, simple as it sounds, was more dangerous to the old world than any rifle or ledger ever could be. Because a person who understands their own worth cannot be easily controlled. Across the weeks of winter, something shifted inside that house. Men who had once learned survival through war, isolation, and silence began to relearn something far more difficult. Trust without possession, care without expectation, love without control. They did not save her, and she did not fix them. Instead, they met in the only place where real human connection can exist: mutual recognition. The recognition that pain does not rank people, that trauma does not make someone less worthy of love. That strength is not the absence of breaking, but the willingness to stay open after you have broken. Even Huck, haunted by the ghosts of war, learned that being seen in his weakest moment did not make him less of a man. Cale, shaped by prejudice and inheritance, learned that gentleness is not weakness, but discipline. And Garrison, who once believed control was the same as safety, learned that safety built on ownership is no safety at all. And Abigail, she learned the most dangerous truth of all, that freedom is not given. It is recognized. It is lived. It is defended. When the storm came, when wolves circled, when fire consumed the barn, when corruption tried to erase them from the land, it was never about who was strongest. It was about who still believed they had the right to stand where they were standing. And Abigail stood again and again, not because she was told to, but because she chose to. That choice changed everything. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.